My friends, colleagues, and citizens of the world, let me begin by asking a simple but powerful question. How many times must we watch history repeat itself before we learn its lessons? Today, as we witness the tragic escalation between Israel and Yemen following yet another violation of a fragile truce, we are reminded that power, when unchecked, always breeds resistance, and resistance, when ignored, always turns into revolt. What we are seeing is not merely another episode in Middle Eastern conflict. It is the latest chapter in a global story of injustice, imperialism, and the failure of diplomacy dominated by profit rather than humanity. The latest violation of the ceasefire agreement by Israel has once again plunged the Middle East into turmoil, reigniting tensions that the world had only begun to hope were subsiding. It is a story as old as conflict itself, promises of peace broken by the pull of power, by political arrogance, and by the cold machinery of war that seems to operate beyond the reach of diplomacy. This latest breach, occurring after weeks of uneasy calm, has sparked outrage not only in the region but across the global community as voices from Yemen to Europe condemn what they see as a reckless disregard for international law and human life. The question echoing now in capitals around the world is simple yet haunting. Was the truce ever truly meant to hold, or was it merely a pause before the next storm? In the fragile landscape of Middle Eastern politics, ceasefires are not just pieces of paper, they are lifelines. They represent the hope of families to return home, of children to sleep without the hum of drones overhead, of nations to rebuild what years of war have torn apart. But when one side repeatedly violates that fragile trust, it does more than restart hostilities. It destroys faith itself. Israel's decision to break the truce, justified as always under the rhetoric of security measures, has reignited an already combustible situation. The attack that triggered Yemen's retaliation has become a symbol of the deep imbalance in power and justice that defines the region. For many observers, this was not just an act of aggression, but an act of defiance against the very idea of peace. Yemen's swift and fierce response was not simply a military maneuver. It was a political statement, a message to Israel and to the global powers that back it. The missiles that struck Tel Aviv were, in the eyes of many across the Arab world, a declaration that smaller nations can no longer be bullied into silence. They were the physical manifestation of anger that has been simmering for decades, an anger born of occupation, blockade, and humiliation. And yet, as the smoke rises over Tel Aviv, the tragedy remains the same. It is ordinary civilians on both sides who pay the price for the ambitions of their leaders. Analysts warn that this renewed conflict may reshape regional alliances in unpredictable ways. Yemen, long viewed as the underdog in the geopolitical chessboard, has shown both capability and resolve, challenging the perception of its weakness. Israel, meanwhile, finds itself facing not only military repercussions, but also growing international criticism. In European capitals, in the United Nations, and even among some American lawmakers, questions are being raised about Israel's commitment to peace and its reliance on the doctrine of force over negotiation. The violation of this ceasefire has not only reignited warfare, it has reignited debate, dissent, and division on a global scale. And yet, beneath the politics and the press releases lies a more profound truth, one that cuts through the noise of propaganda and policy. Every broken truce weakens the world's faith in diplomacy. Every missile fired makes the next peace harder to achieve. What began as a single violation has spiraled into a regional crisis that threatens to destabilize not just borders, but the very belief that dialogue can triumph over destruction. It is a chilling reminder that when the powerful abandon restraint, the powerless are forced to find strength in resistance. The ceasefire's collapse is not just the story of one nation breaking a promise, it is the story of a world that keeps allowing peace to be postponed. The world watched in shock as Yemen's retaliatory strikes pierced the night sky over Tel Aviv, marking a dramatic escalation in a conflict that had already reached a boiling point. What began as an act of defiance quickly became a symbol of shifting power dynamics in the Middle East, a region where decades of war, occupation, and political manipulation have left behind deep scars and deeper resentment. The attacks, launched in direct response to Israel's violation of the ceasefire, were not just missiles flying through the air, they were messages, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. In the words of one regional analyst, Yemen didn't just strike Tel Aviv, it struck the myth of invulnerability that Israel has carried for generations. The scale and precision of the strikes shocked military observers. Tel Aviv, long believed to be shielded by one of the world's most sophisticated defense systems, found itself under an unexpected barrage that exposed vulnerabilities in its security infrastructure. Air raid sirens wailed through the night, residents rushed to shelters, and the Israeli government scrambled to respond. The psychological impact of these attacks rippled through the population far beyond the physical destruction they caused. For the first time in years, the conflict that Israel had mostly managed to externalize, fought far from its central cities, had arrived on its doorstep. It was not just a military event, it was a moment of reckoning. Yemen's leadership framed the strikes as an act of legitimate defense, a response to years of provocation, airstrikes, and political humiliation. Their message was unmistakable. The days of silence were over. For too long, Yemen had been painted as the victim, impoverished, war-torn, and powerless. But this act flipped the narrative, transforming the nation's image from one of suffering to one of defiance. Across the Arab world, the reaction was electric. Social media platforms erupted with messages of solidarity, celebrating what many saw as a rare moment of resistance against a regional power that has long operated with impunity. The symbolism was powerful. A country under siege had dared to hit back. Yet, amid the geopolitical theater, the human cost cannot be ignored. Tel Aviv's streets, once symbols of modernity and resilience, were littered with debris. The echoes of explosions replaced the hum of daily life. Families were displaced, homes destroyed, and fear became the language of the city. The retaliatory strikes, while politically charged, underscored the harsh truth that in war there are no real victors, only survivors. The tragedy of innocent lives lost or forever changed serves as a haunting reminder that every act of retaliation fuels the endless cycle of violence that grips the region. Internationally, the strikes triggered waves of condemnation and concern. Western capitals expressed outrage, calling for restraint, while nations sympathetic to Yemen's plight defended the attacks as a desperate but justified reaction to ongoing Israeli aggression. The United Nations convened emergency sessions, but the familiar choreography unfolded: statements, condemnations, and diplomatic hand-wringing with little tangible change. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies and defense analysts began recalculating, reassessing Yemen's growing military capabilities and what they mean for the balance of power in the region. And so, as dawn broke over Tel Aviv, a new reality emerged from the smoke. The strikes were more than a tactical retaliation. They were a strategic declaration that Yemen, once dismissed as a fractured state, now possessed the will and the means to alter the regional equation. The message was both defiant and devastatingly clear. When diplomacy fails, when truces are broken, and when justice is denied, even the weakest can make the strongest tremble. In that single, harrowing night, Yemen's retaliation reshaped the political landscape, proving that in today's world, no nation, no matter how powerful, is beyond the reach of consequence. The reverberations of Yemen's retaliatory strikes against Tel Aviv have reached far beyond the borders of the Middle East, sending shockwaves through global political and economic systems. What began as a regional confrontation has now evolved into an international crisis, testing alliances, exposing hypocrisies, and forcing world powers to confront uncomfortable truths about their roles in perpetuating instability. The question gripping analysts and policymakers alike is not merely how this escalation will end, but what it reveals about the fragile state of global order itself. As one European diplomat admitted in a moment of candor, this is not just a Middle Eastern conflict anymore. It's a mirror reflecting the world's moral contradictions. Almost immediately after the strikes, global markets reacted with anxiety. Energy prices spiked as investors feared further disruption in vital shipping lanes through the Red Sea, while defense stocks soared on speculation of new military spending. The incident highlighted how deeply intertwined modern warfare has become with global capitalism, where every explosion ripples through financial systems, enriching some while impoverishing others. For critics like Professor Richard D. Wolff, this is no coincidence but a symptom of an economic order that profits from perpetual conflict. The political fallout, therefore, is not just measured in diplomatic statements, but in the cold calculus of markets that thrive on instability. In Washington, the response was predictably polarized. Officials condemned Yemen's actions as unacceptable aggression, yet avoided acknowledging Israel's prior violation of the truce that sparked the chain of events. Behind closed doors, however, divisions emerged. Some U.S. lawmakers warned that continued unconditional support for Israel risks isolating America from its allies in the global South, where sympathy for Yemen's stance runs deep. Meanwhile, voices in Europe grew louder, demanding an independent inquiry into the conflict's origins and urging an end to double standards that have long undermined Western credibility in the Arab world. The moral authority of Western diplomacy, already eroded by decades of selective outrage, has rarely looked weaker. At the United Nations, emergency sessions devolved into the familiar pattern of condemnation without consequence. The Security Council, paralyzed by veto politics, once again proved incapable of addressing the root causes of the conflict. Yet outside those chambers, a different narrative took shape. Civil society movements, student organizations, and anti-war activists across continents began framing the crisis not merely as a geopolitical clash, but as a moral reckoning. They asked, how can peace be achieved when justice is ignored? How long can the world preach democracy while funding destruction? These questions, once confined to academic debate, now echo in the streets, in the media, and even within government corridors. The Middle East itself has entered a new phase of uncertainty. Traditional power brokers like Saudi Arabia and Iran are recalculating their strategies, wary of being drawn into a broader confrontation. Regional alliances, already strained by ideological and sectarian divides, are shifting in unpredictable ways. Yemen's defiance, though militarily limited, has reshaped perceptions, proving that even smaller nations can alter the balance of power when driven by desperation and principle. The attacks have also emboldened resistance movements elsewhere, from Palestine to Lebanon, who see in Yemen's retaliation a model of courage against overwhelming odds. For the global community, the lesson is both sobering and urgent. The fallout from these events has shattered the illusion that conflicts can be contained within borders or managed through empty diplomacy. Every broken truce, every retaliatory strike reverberates across continents, destabilizing economies, exposing double standards, and reminding the world that peace built on inequality is peace destined to collapse. The political aftershocks of this confrontation are not confined to Tel Aviv or Sana'a. They are unfolding in parliaments, stock exchanges, and the collective conscience of a world that can no longer look away. The global media's response to the renewed conflict between Israel and Yemen has reignited a long-standing debate about double standards in international journalism. As the first images of destruction in Tel Aviv filled television screens, headlines around the world framed Yemen's retaliatory strikes as acts of terror, while Israel's earlier violation of the truce was described in far milder terms, a defensive measure or a strategic operation. The contrast was striking and, for many observers, infuriating. The question that echoed across social platforms and press conferences alike was simple yet piercing. Why is aggression by the powerful always sanitized, while resistance by the powerless is always demonized? This selective moral framing has become not just a media flaw, but a mechanism of control, shaping how the world perceives justice, victimhood, and legitimacy. Throughout the coverage, major Western outlets appeared to follow a familiar script, one that presents Israel as a nation under constant siege and Yemen as a reckless aggressor. This pattern is not new. It has been repeated across countless conflicts involving asymmetrical power dynamics, where narratives are dictated not by facts on the ground, but by geopolitical alliances. For instance, when Israeli warplanes bombed Yemeni territories in the days before the truce collapsed, much of the Western press downplayed the event, describing it as a targeted strike on militant positions. Yet when Yemen retaliated, the language shifted dramatically. Words like unprovoked, terror, and escalation dominated the headlines. Such linguistic choices are not innocent. They reflect a deeper bias that privileges certain states' actions while erasing the suffering of others. Professor Richard D. Wolff and other political analysts have long criticized this imbalance as a symptom of an information economy aligned with power. The media, they argue, functions less as a watchdog of truth and more as a gatekeeper of narratives that serve economic and political interests. Corporate-owned news networks, dependent on government access and defense advertising revenue, often reproduce the logic of empire under the guise of objective reporting. The result is a global audience conditioned to see wars not through the lens of humanity, but through the distorted optics of propaganda. Yemen's defiance, therefore, is not only a military act, but a challenge to this narrative monopoly, a disruption in the story that dominant powers have told for decades. Social media, meanwhile, has become a battleground for truth. Independent journalists, activists, and citizens from Yemen and across the Arab world flooded online platforms with first-hand footage, countering mainstream narratives and exposing the gaps in coverage. Hashtags calling out media hypocrisy trended globally within hours, forcing some networks to adjust their tone or issue clarifications. Yet even this digital resistance faces suppression. Algorithms favor established outlets, while dissenting voices are often flagged, restricted, or dismissed as misinformation. The struggle over who gets to define reality has never been more intense and never more consequential. Beyond mere bias, this disparity in coverage reveals something more profound: the global hierarchy of empathy. The pain of some populations is deemed newsworthy, their suffering narrated with compassion and urgency. Others, Yemenis, Palestinians, Syrians, are reduced to numbers, statistics, or faceless crowds. When Tel Aviv burns, the world weeps. When Sana'a starves, the world scrolls past. This unequal valuation of human life corrodes not only journalism, but the very moral fabric of global society. As Professor Wolff argues, a media system that serves power cannot serve truth. Until that imbalance is confronted, wars will continue to be fought not just with bombs, but with words. Words that decide who deserves sympathy and who deserves silence. The double standards of global media coverage are not merely an ethical failure. They are a weapon of war in themselves, shaping perceptions, justifying violence, and blinding the world to its own complicity. Behind every explosion that lights up the Middle Eastern sky lies a profit sheet, a balance ledger, and a boardroom decision. The grim reality is that modern warfare has become less about ideology or defense and more about economics, a system of endless conflict sustained by those who stand to gain the most from it. The renewed confrontation between Israel and Yemen is no exception. While the world debates the morality of violence, corporations quietly count the dividends of destruction. War, in today's global economy, has become a business model, and peace, inconveniently, has no shareholders. The hook that draws the world in is always framed as security, but what it really secures is profit. Every missile fired, every drone launched, every bunker rebuilt feeds an industry so vast and entrenched that it has outgrown the very governments meant to regulate it. The military industrial complex, that unholy alliance of political power and private capital, thrives on instability. When Israel violated the truce and reignited tensions, defense stocks surged almost instantly. The markets, it seems, anticipated blood long before it was spilled. Analysts on Wall Street called it a rise in defense optimism, a chilling euphemism for human tragedy turned into quarterly gain. Meanwhile, as Tel Aviv burned and Yemen braced for retaliation, billions were exchanged in contracts for weapons, surveillance technology, and reconstruction partnerships. In the grim arithmetic of war, destruction is simply the prelude to another investment cycle. Professor Richard D. Wolff has long argued that capitalism, in its globalized form, depends on conflict to survive. When economies stagnate, war becomes the stimulus package. It mobilizes production, creates jobs, and generates demand for industries that otherwise would languish. Tanks replace tractors, missiles replace medicine, and nations are told that armament equals advancement. The ideology of endless growth finds its justification in endless war. Israel's decades-long militarization, backed by Western funding, is a textbook case. Defense contracts flow seamlessly between Washington and Tel Aviv, ensuring that every escalation, whether labeled defense or deterrence, keeps the economic wheels spinning. The tragedy is that these wheels are greased with the lives of ordinary people whose suffering is seen as collateral rather than consequence. Yemen, by contrast, represents the opposite side of this economic divide, a nation impoverished by blockade, war, and foreign interference, yet rich in strategic geography. Its ports and proximity to key global shipping routes make it an unavoidable piece on the geopolitical chessboard. The strikes on Tel Aviv were not only an act of defiance, but also a statement against this exploitative system. In a world where economic sanctions, trade manipulation, and debt have become tools of warfare, Yemen's response symbolized resistance to being reduced to a pawn in someone else's profit scheme. Still, the response itself will be monetized through arms sales, insurance hikes, and the booming reconstruction industry that follows every bombardment. What makes this cycle so enduring is its invisibility. Politicians speak of defense spending, not war profits. Media outlets praise technological advancements in missile systems without mentioning that each one costs millions that could fund hospitals, schools, or housing. The public, distracted by patriotic rhetoric, rarely sees the machinery of profit behind the curtain of war. But as Professor Wolff often reminds audiences, capitalism turns everything, even suffering, into a commodity. When peace threatens profit margins, war becomes policy. And so, long after the bombs stop falling, contracts are still being signed, fortunes are still being made, and humanity continues to foot the bill. The economic motive behind endless war is not a secret. It's simply a truth too profitable for the powerful to admit. Out of the rubble of Tel Aviv and the defiance of Yemen arises not just another geopolitical debate, but a cry that echoes far beyond national borders, a demand for a new global order rooted in justice, equality, and human dignity. The old order, built on exploitation, hypocrisy, and economic domination, is collapsing under the weight of its contradictions. For decades, the world has been told that peace comes through power, that security is achieved through military supremacy, and that prosperity flows from free markets. Yet every war, every broken truce, and every act of retaliation exposes the lie. The call now, louder than ever, is not for more weapons or sanctions, but for a restructuring of how nations coexist, not through coercion, but through cooperation, not through profit, but through principle. The current system rewards the powerful and punishes the weak. It allows certain nations to wage wars under the banner of democracy while condemning others for defending their sovereignty. This double standard has become the moral cancer of international politics. As Professor Richard D. Wolff often argues, you cannot build peace on the foundations of inequality. A new global order must begin with dismantling the economic and political hierarchies that perpetuate conflict. It must acknowledge that true stability comes not from domination, but from justice. Justice in trade, in diplomacy, and in the right of every nation to live free from interference and exploitation. The confrontation between Israel and Yemen is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a system that values profit over people, allegiance over accountability. In the emerging world consciousness, especially among the youth, there is a growing realization that the status quo cannot continue. Movements across continents, from anti-war protests in Europe to social justice campaigns in the Middle East and Africa, are converging around a single truth. Peace without justice is nothing more than a pause between wars. This new generation refuses to inherit a world defined by imperial greed and corporate control. They demand transparency in media, fairness in diplomacy, and humanity in policy. Their voices, amplified by technology and unified by purpose, represent the early rumblings of a global awakening. For nations like Yemen, long marginalized and silenced, this awakening is an opportunity to reclaim agency. The retaliatory strikes that shook Tel Aviv were not only acts of resistance, but symbols of a shifting power balance. Smaller nations are no longer content to serve as chess pieces in the games of global elites. Their defiance marks the birth of a multipolar world, one where influence is earned by integrity, not inherited through might. The new global order must give equal weight to every nation's voice, Regardless of military strength or economic size, it must prioritize dialogue over domination, mutual respect over manipulation. Yet this transformation will not come easily. Those who profit from chaos will resist change with every weapon at their disposal, political, economic, and ideological. But history teaches us that no empire lasts forever. The fall of colonialism, the rise of independence movements, and the ongoing struggle for global equality all prove that justice, though delayed, is never denied. The growing disillusionment with Western dominated institutions signals that a turning point is near. The new order being demanded is not utopian, it is necessary. It envisions a world where no child fears the sound of warplanes, where no nation's sovereignty is for sale, and where peace is not negotiated by the powerful, but built by the just. The time for that transformation is now, because humanity cannot afford another century of injustice disguised as order.